He says. Oh.
Indeed, I can. Very good evening to you.
Yes, I can hear you, Dan. How are you? Okay, can you hear me? Is that better? Cool, thank you.
I can, yes, thank you.
Can't be seen on the other screen, but we can see him on this screen, so we'll make sure.
Well.
Yeah, and I think our colleagues from Ernst & Young are also online as well. So let's make a start and get through the agenda. I think we're here till 8 or sooner, if we can avoid it. Apologies for absence or lateness. Do we have any apologies for absence or lateness?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we do. We have apologies of absence from Councillor Rangzeb.
Okay. Thank you. Councillor Shires.
Chair, I need to leave at 7:15 if that's okay. Just got another engagement.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Item 2 is declarations of interest. Does any member wish to declare any disclosable pecuniary interest or non-statutory disclosable interest? If so, can they please raise their hand now? I'm seeing no hands raised. I think I may have to disclose it. I'll raise it anyway. So I've just taken on some consultancy work for a Peterborough firm, which is the Chartered Institute of Credit Management. I don't think that is a declaration of interest, but I'll mention it anyway, just in case it turns out to be at some point. Okay. So item 3, minutes of the meeting held on 17th of October. We're asked to agree the minutes of the meeting held. Can I have a proposer and a seconder for those minutes? Okay, Councillor Alley to propose, Councillor Hussey to second. Thank you. Item 4, actions and matters arising. Dan, do you want to introduce the report?
Sure can. Thank you, Chair. Yep. So members aware, this is the action log that the committee started back at the beginning of the financial year. So what I did following the last meetings, I separated those that were completed and put those at the bottom of the page, those towards the top of the ones that are still live. There was one on there that was overdue, but speaking to the member, at the moment there's nothing more we can do with that action, so it'll close down.
Okay, Councillor Sanford.
Yeah, I was the person concerned. It's just that the point I raised at the previous meeting, I couldn't find any email actual evidence for it. It was just the conversation that I'd heard. So I think on the basis of that, it can't be pursued any further. So.
Okay, so you'd like that action closed?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Aren't any further comments? Can I take it we note the actions and matters arising?
So Chair, I don't know if you want to just put the Appendix B there, which is your update that you had given to the improvement panel. So I don't know if you want members just to note that.
Oh yes, I'm conscious that I've been chair of the committee since about March, and I'm aware that nothing's really gone out from this committee to the rest of the council to show what we've been doing. So rather than wait for the annual report, I did a very short interim report to the improvement panel, which simply summarised some of the things that we've been looking at over the past 6 months, and that's included as part of these action points. I just didn't want there to be a void of silence, because we have been talking about some quite good things, and we do have some concerns as well, which I want to start to percolate sooner rather than later, rather than wait for an annual report. Okay, so okay.
Just on the actions log, I noticed the last set of actions were from the meeting on the 25th of July. Is there always going to be a 1 meeting lag on actions? Because we had some actions coming out of the minutes that aren't on the actions log.
Which meeting? Because there's some, should be some for the 17th of October meeting, if you scroll
Yes.
further down. Yeah, they're on there.
Okay, did I?
You might just scroll down a bit further, they should be on there.
Descending date order, sorry. I thought it was ascending. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Councillor Sanford.
Yeah, and I just wanted to support what you're proposing in terms of circulating an interim report, because I think, as I've indicated at previous meetings, my impression from talking to colleagues in sort of our group is that there's a need for a PR job really in terms of audit committee, because I think the general assumption in the council seems to be that we all just sit here ploughing through loads of accounts and things, and I think maybe people don't appreciate the breadth of what audit committee actually covers.
Great, thank you. Okay, so can I take it we note the actions and matters arising and look forward to receiving further feedback on actions going forward? Okay, now we can move into item 5, which is the use of regulation of Investigatory Powers Act. And I think we've got Ben Stevenson who's going to come and present the report, accepting that our members have read it.
Thank you, Chair. I think we come every year to talk about RIPA. I think given it's a fairly new committee, I thought it was worth explaining what RIPA covers. It does cover our use of covert surveillance powers, which I think you'll notice we haven't used and haven't used for some time. It does mean when we're inspected by the Surveillance Commissioner, they look at policy, they look at training, they look at our procedures to make sure we do have things in place. We are going to have to review our policies. We've got a new monitoring officer, and it's a minor change of name. as I say, I mean, we haven't used the powers. Ironically, myself and Councillor Coles have talked about how overt cameras have proven more successful in fly tipping and other areas than covert, actually. So we did last get inspected in 2021. It was a very light touch inspection given we hadn't used any of the powers. So we will obviously keep reporting to you on our use, if we do use them or not, as we're required to under the statutory code. And we'll bring back any policy changes, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you, Ben. Do we have any questions? So Councillor Sanford and then Mike.
Yeah, I think having been a councillor for quite a long time, I can actually remember when the Regulatory and Investigative Powers Act was actually brought in, and certainly instinctively I'm very much opposed to the sort of use of this sort of covert sort of surveillance. But I think from the report, you know, the fact that we are very restrained in how we exercise the powers, and we haven't actually used them for quite some time. So I think that does give me some degree of reassurance.
I too can remember them coming in. I've been here that long. So I do know we've always used them as a last resort. We're very proportionate when we have used them. And probably the biggest change in the time I've been here is that we may authorise our use, but we have to go to a magistrate, to the judiciary to get approval. So there is always that extra check before we start using them. And as I said, they are the last resort for us.
Right. Mike, you had a question.
Yes, I think there were a couple of things I noticed from the report. So the first one was there was an observation in there that we'd closed one of the open issues following the IPCO inspection report. And I have to say that was the first time I'd ever known we had any open inspection issues. And I guess the question is, for me, are there any more of them? And if so, can we have, you know, in the regular report you give to us, some kind of update on and tracking of those issues? You know, it doesn't need to be in a huge amount of detail, but I think I would at least like to know whether we were on time with closing issues from the IPCO, whether we had 5, 10 or 30 of them open, or none at all. And I think just some kind of regular reporting of that sort, if there are any other open issues. And I have to say, I wasn't aware even we had the one that we've closed, let alone whether there are any more.
Well, I mean, I'm trying to remember when the previous inspection to 2021 was. I think it was 2018, and we'd closed it since then. I perhaps should have made that clear in the report. It had already been closed long before they'd come. What tends to happen is we'll get a letter setting out what we need to do, and we have a month or so to confirm we've accepted them and we've done it. I can't remember off the top of my head what it was, but we closed it fairly simply. It was something in our policy. If I remember, I wouldn't quote, but I think it was to do with covert human intelligence sources and our explanation, but we did that relatively easily. But yes, if there are any things from future inspections, we would bring it here so that you knew what those issues were and how quickly we'd resolve them.
Okay, thank you. And then the second bit I was rather unclear on was you included a copy of the current policy as an appendix, but I was very confused by the status of that policy. So you talked in places around an updated draft policy. This policy seemed to have a 2019 or 2020 date on it, something like that. And I wasn't sure whether what you were presenting was an updated latest version, whether it was the current enforced policy or what the status of it was. But irrespective of that, it had included in it a due date for review of August 22, which is clearly passed, and therefore, when's it next going to be updated, and what's the cycle on this, and how does that work?
The policy you've got is the current one. If there's a date in there, it should have been changed. We did change it after the last inspection. We have changed it in line with Cambridge because it's a shared policy with them. It is being reviewed at the moment. I think I was aware that we might see some changes in the council, and also the potential that we might separate from Cambridgeshire in it. So we will be reviewing it to check that nothing's changed in the statutory code of practice. But if there's anything we need to update officer-wise, then we will do. It will probably be early next year that I'd bring it back to this committee for you to see any changes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. And I suppose we've got to remember that this is an item that sits on our agenda every single meeting anyway, so you've always got a slot then to go and update us with whatever it is that's changed. Okay, thank you. If there are no more questions, I'd like to move to the recommendations on page 25, which is to receive the comments and note a report on the authority's progress, application and use of powers within the regulation of Investigatory Powers Act 2000. Can we agree to these recommendations? Okay, I see none, so I don't see any dissent. Thank you. So, item 6, the annual report of corporate complaints 21-22, and I think we've got Belinda here to give us this report. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm just going to highlight some key points within the report. This is the first time this annual report has been brought to Audit Committee. The report's not been to any committee in the previous 2 years due to the pandemic. It wasn't called for. From next year, the Chief Executive has also asked for this report to include all complaints to the Council, including statutory complaints, which have previously gone to scrutiny committees. My understanding is that the children's and adults reports will still go to those respective scrutiny committees once they've been to Audit Committee, but I need to have that confirmed. Prior to this evening's meeting, the committee chair has asked that in future reports the cost of compensation and direct costs from investigations is included, and I've compiled that for the year in question, but it's not included in the report because it had already been submitted. There has been a request for a more detailed analysis of Aragon complaints, which is going to be fed back to the client monitoring manager, and I know the finance director has agreed to do that. Referring to the 2021-22 corporate complaints, the complaint volumes have generally returned to pre-COVID levels. 25% of all complaints are informally resolved. Going forward, our aim is to encourage this type of response more, as this has the highest success rate at resolving complaints quickly and efficiently. Whether an informal or formal response is given, resolution at stage 1, the local stage as we call it, is high, with 95% of complaints resolved locally by the service area now. The complaint uphold rate is around 50%, and this is a combined figure of both fully and partially upheld complaints. And this uphold rate demonstrates that service failures are recognised and rectified. We've had feedback from the Ombudsman this year, as we do every year, and the annual letter from the Ombudsman is included in a link at the bottom of the report. This year we're performing well in terms of complaints upheld by the Ombudsman, so we had a rate of 40% upheld, which is lower than the average for unitary authorities, and compliance with recommendations, which was at 100%, as all recommendations have been delivered. The areas where we need to improve are providing suitable remedies in advance of a complaint going to the Ombudsman, and ensuring timescales are clear and escalated complaints are concluded more promptly. Changes have been agreed to the corporate process to meet these objectives, which will be put in place in Q4 of the current year. And this is just a brief outline of the main points of the report, and I'm open to your questions.
Great, thank you. So I think you mentioned about us getting an appreciation of the cost of complaints. Have we got that number, or have we got any comparatives as well?
Comparators from previous years, or comparators with other councils, or?
I'll take both, or either.
So in terms of comparators with previous years, as I say, we've not reported it in the report before, but I can provide data over a number of years because we capture that on our database. So I'm happy to do a briefing note to give the up-to-date information to this year, and then in future years include the new figures and compare them to the previous figures if that's what you would like to see.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah, great. Okay.
So I don't know how quickly you want that information. But...
just as soon as you can would be great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Because whilst it's on our agenda and in our minds, it helps to put things into perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I can quote you the figures from 21-22. I've got those to hand. If you'd like.
Let's hear them now, and then we can take some questions.
So we've got 3 complaints processes, and we keep those all separate: adult social care, children's, and corporate. So the corporate ones, we had one payment out of £1,400 this last year, 2021-22, on a special educational needs case. And under children's, we had 2 cases that attracted one payment of £100 and one payment of £550. And in adults, we had no compensation payments.
Right, so very, very small values then.
They were. They were that year. I think one of the areas where we do see higher compensation levels usually will be in children's. And we had a backlog of cases because of the pandemic. There were a lot of investigations that had to be held up because we couldn't get investigators. So we have seen in the current year more cases getting to that stage and larger payments being paid out. We also do usually have a couple of special educational needs complaints where compensation is due in most years. So in the particular year that we're referring to, there was just one. This year, I think there's been 2. So accumulating the payments from all of the investigations across all 3 areas, you will see a higher amount now that we've got back to business as usual.
Yep, great. Okay, but at least it gives us some scale. We're not talking hundreds of thousands of pounds. We're less than £10,000 in that total in the way that you described it.
Yeah,
okay.
we wouldn't generally see payments of more than about £10,000. Probably about the highest we've ever had to pay out in one case.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. So, Councillor Alley, I think you had a question.
I did, yeah. I think we recognise that obviously an organisation of our size, we're bound to make mistakes and people are bound to complain, and it's the journey that they go on. During that complaints process, we're paying compensation. That's to be expected. But then there's some items in here, things about some residents being unhappy, language like accusations of financial deception, bullying, threats. That sounds quite serious, and I'm just wondering whether we've tried to isolate these kinds of incidents, and do we have appropriate training in place for our staff so that nobody feels like that, regardless of, I mean, they can be unhappy, they can be potentially mistreated inadvertently, but financial deception, threats, bullying, I know they're accusations, but what have we done specifically with those, and do we have training for our staff?
We do try and report the kind of language that we see coming in from customers. So that will be how we've captured the complaint, depending on how the customer's raised it with us. But those areas will be looked at by the investigator that's responding to the complaint. And obviously, any complaint that was serious and upheld would be referred to a more senior manager to look at. So how the complaints process works is that you have a complaint being dealt with by a team manager at the first point of call. So if a customer's making a complaint about an officer, that officer wouldn't respond to that complaint. So there'll always be a degree of separation from the person that's being accused of something. And then if that customer's not happy with that response, we get these types of complaints in things like council tax, for example. So I know that we had one recently where a customer felt that their money was being attributed to the wrong debts, and they were being misled as to how the debts were being paid, and the language used by the customer was quite vehement, let's say. But in terms of what actually was happening, it was just a lack of clarity in terms of the information that the customer was given about how they will assign payments when they come in for customers that have got debts over several years. They would need to make it clearer to the customer that the way the customer wanted the payments assigned was not how they could do it because of the policy, which said the oldest debt needed to be paid first. So the customer may have felt they were being deceived, but actually it was referring to the policy. It was the correct way of applying the payments. So by the time the response to the customer goes, you'll see the language used will be more measured, but also that, you know, every part of that customer's concern will have been investigated properly.
Good. Yeah, the example you gave, I saw that in there, and that was just a lack of communication from us to the customer, or making it crystal clear that we were going to allocate the payments to the oldest debt rather than the most recent debt. So that's fine. My point, I think you've probably not quite answered my question. My question was, we are going to do things wrong, and we are going to ultimately have to pay compensation. That's almost inevitable. But I don't think at any point we should be bullying or deceiving residents. Was that part of the investigation? And subsequent to that, have we gone back to our staff and given them some training?
So if an allegation is made of something serious like misconduct or bullying, that will be investigated by the manager responsible. So if that was then found to be true, they would take that matter through the disciplinary process. So that wouldn't be part of the complaint response to the customer, because that's an HR matter and that would proceed along that. What they may say to the customer is that, you know, we found that we've been at fault through these things, or we've given you the wrong information. But obviously if the customer wants to take it further and they do feel that it is bullying or racism, you know, these types of accusations, then they may pursue the complaint through every stage until they get you know, an answer that they're happy with. And sometimes customers won't get an answer that they're happy with, and they'll go off to the Ombudsman. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of retraining, I think we can't retrain people not to bully customers. That is something that's not acceptable anyway. So the type of retraining that they will have is things like, you know, knowing the procedures better, how to deal with customers in terms of customer service standards and that sort of thing.
Okay, got another question from Stuart online, and then over to Councillor Shaz after that. So Stuart.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, thank you, Chair. It was just by way of arrogant. The other trading companies as well, any other arm's length bodies. Just thinking principally in terms of reputational risk. How able are we to get information from them? How able are we to request additional information regarding complaints from them? Is this kind of a hard contractual relationship, or can we simply just get whatever we need by way of request? So when the contract for wastes first went out in 2012, I think it was, we had it was with Enterprise, then it went to Amy, now it's with Aragon. And the first two companies were established companies who already dealt with complaints for other local authorities. So they had established complaints processes, and we knew exactly how they were going to pursue with complaints, and there was better reporting, I think, than we have now. And gradually over the last few years, we're getting very high-level figures when I ask for those figures at the end of the year. We're not getting to the level of detail that we used to have, which includes all the service areas that, from, you know, garden waste to, you know, the different types of waste, bulky waste, grass cutting. We're not getting to that level of details about where the complaints actually are, and whether they're justified or not justified, which we also used to get. And we used to get it broken down into quarters and that sort of thing. We're now getting high-level figures, an annual amount of complaints. So I would say that it's not the level of detail that I've seen in the past, and I would prefer to have a better level of detail so that we can compare one year with another. How we get that information, there is a client monitoring team who manage the contract with Aragon, and we can make requests for that level of data, but gradually the data we're being provided is not as strong as it used to be.
Stuart, I can see that sort of answers your question, but doesn't solve the problem. it sounds like we need more detailed information. It should be part of the contract, and the contract monitoring team should be making sure that it comes through if it is part of the contract.
Yeah, exactly. I think
so it sounds like there's a follow-up there to be done to make sure that we're getting what we're paying for.
If I'm honest, whenever we have new contractors who take over services, small or large, we're often on the back foot in terms of the complaints process that they're using. So I'm often having to go to service areas and saying, okay, you've introduced this new contractor, have you discussed with them how complaints are going to be managed? And often that's the last thought that happens. So we have had situations where contracts have started, no complaints process in place, and we've had to agree that we follow the council's complaints process with that contract because they don't have one of their own. So there is some improvements that could be made in terms of when we have new contractors.
Great. Okay, that's something for the procurement team to add into their work as well. So, Councillor Shaz Nawaz.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of questions, Belinda, if I may. Following on from the request I made last week, looking at obviously this bar chart here, I'm not surprised we've got a high number of complaints for highways and Aragon, because those are the kind of complaints that I see and other councillors obviously see on a regular basis. And without obviously having the detail I requested last week, it's a bit difficult obviously to understand what those complaints are. But generally speaking, in your experience and based on everything you know, what's being done proactively to address regular and frequent complaints so that we can obviously stop them happening in the future?
Well, as you can imagine, most complaints that we get about Aragon are about bins. And my colleagues in the call centre take a lot of those complaints and requests for service every day, and they go onto a system that's shared with Aragon, and some things are flagged as service requests and some are flagged as complaints. The complaint should then follow the complaints process with Aragon, and sometimes if it doesn't get resolved, it comes back into the council for a final review by the client monitoring manager. He will then have meetings with that service to look at common themes, and he also arranges meetings between our call centre, who do the majority of complaints that come through, with Aragon, so that they can discuss things that are happening frequently and how they can improve the service, so that feedback is leading to service improvement. What I've requested just in the last week is that my service are represented at that meeting also, because we are finding some problems where customers are going round in a loop, going to Aragon and coming back to my central complaints team, having started off at the call centre, and it may be something simple like a mist bin, and they're being told to do something differently next week so they can get the rubbish collected, and then that goes wrong as well, and then it becomes an accumulated problem. And sometimes it will be something as simple as a new route where a driver's not familiar with some of the corner properties or something like that. So yeah, we do need to try and get together more to try and resolve some of these frequent problems that come up. And I know they've been having some resourcing issues at Aragon in terms of their complaints team, and that's not helped recently. So that's why I've been making those requests to James Coleridge, that I get more of an oversight of what's happening with those complaints, because they will escalate and they'll end up with my team. And then we don't want a bin complaint going to the Ombudsman. That would be awful. We haven't had one in many years. So.
Okay, thank you.
Second question about, so it's a work in progress.
It is, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Second question, just for me to understand this better, is there a particular process that we have in order to qualify a complaint, or is it basically somebody writing in and saying, I'm complaining because I'm unhappy? Because sometimes what I find is people might write in to suggest it's a complaint, but they're unhappy with the situation because either they've not been heard or they've been ignored. So it isn't actually a complaint, it's just to say, can you escalate this matter for me and get it sorted, as opposed to I'm complaining and I want to go down the official channel. So how do we qualify it?
So there's
we don't use a single definition of what a complaint is, so it's very subjective, depending on the language the customer's using, how often something's happened, you know, what they want done about it. So our call centre team are very much trained in identifying the difference between a simple request for service and something that's more significant. And they will use different codes on their logging system to highlight to Aragon that this is that type or this type. When a customer comes to us in central complaints, majority of the time they do want to make a complaint, but sometimes they'll be not sure how to get a matter across to the right service, so they'll come to us. So we do deal with a percentage of requests for service in my team as well. So it is quite subjective, but we also make contact with the customer and just clarify what it is they want. So the majority of complaints come in on our online form, about 80%. Of the complaints we log come that way. And so my team will just pick up the phone and ring the customer and say, what's exactly happened? We're not quite sure what you mean, and have you been in contact with anyone first? That sort of thing. So.
Thank you, Belinda.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. If there are any more questions, there was sorry, Councillor Sanford.
Yeah, I've got a question and I've got a couple of comments and observations really. So I'll do the question first. It's on the same topic that I think the gentleman on the line asked and what Shaz was asking. I had a particularly horrendous complaint I was dealing with on behalf of a constituent that involved MPS, and it went on for almost like a 2-year period. I'm still not entirely convinced it's been resolved, but so I think I do have a concern from what I'm hearing that complaints involving external contractors or bodies that we've got partnerships with, whether it's Aragon, MPS or other ones, in some circumstances it could be dealt with by their own internal complaint process. So do they have like the same system we have, a stage 1 and a stage 2, and then potential to go to the Ombudsman? And I'm almost wondering, wouldn't we be better actually having all complaints, whether they're regarding a contractor or regarding the council, coming through the council process? Because otherwise, isn't there a danger that, as you mentioned, you know, somebody could have a complaint about Aragon, it could go through Aragon's processes and end up going to the Ombudsman, and you guys wouldn't have any information on it. So I know it comes over as a bit authoritarian, but wouldn't we be better bringing all the complaints in-house in the same way that we're actually looking to bring quite a lot of the services in-house?
The only service really at the moment, the only major service that has an external complaints process is the Aragon one. So both Skanska Highways Department, as we call it, still, and Serco do use the council's complaints process. So all of their complaints would go through the council's two-stage process. With Aragon, what happens is they have a 3-stage process. And when, if the customer gets to the end of that process and not happy, we don't make the customer go through our 2-stage process as well, because that wouldn't be very fair to the customer, and the Ombudsman would certainly comment on that. So what happens is there's a review done by the client monitoring manager, who will look at how that complaint's been responded to by Aragon, and will make a final determination if he accepts their position or he feels, as a spokesperson of the council, he wants them to do something differently, and he will make that determination. And that has a final sign-off before we either say to the customer, we're happy with how Aragon's managed this matter and we don't have any further information for you, and you have the right to go to the Ombudsman, or we've asked Aragon to change their position on this. So that's what usually happens. As I say, there are some small contractors that we have across the council. We had a contract with Kingdom for a little while who did enforcement, and they had a separate process, 2 stages, and again we had a review at the end of it. MPS was the same. So
yeah, we do have other complaints processes, but they do then dovetail into our process instead of going through our process as well. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you. I just got a couple of observations, really. I think Appendix C of the report is really encouraging to see, because I was, a number of years ago, I used to work for an insurance company in the customer services role, and we got sent on a training course that was run by this American guy, and he said organisations shouldn't have complaints processes, they should have customer service opportunity processes. So I think having Appendix C, where you're actually identifying areas where services have been improved as a result of complaints, is quite encouraging. I think Appendix D is also encouraging, and that we are recording compliments where people, go onto the website and positively describe experiences that they've had where they've received really good customer service. One of the roles I do, apart from being on this committee, is I'm also the deputy mayor at the moment, and what we do occasionally is we actually put receptions on in the mayor's parlour, which can be for external organisations, but we've also got a couple of examples where we're doing them for people. I think there's one guy working for Escom Industries who's worked for an extremely long period of time. So I sort of had this thought when I was reading the papers as to, because we've got around about 8 examples here of people internally who've been recognised as providing exemplary service. And would it be an idea maybe to think about, doing an annual reception or something where we basically have these people along and we recognise the exemplary service that they've given? Just something for me, maybe you could go away and think about it.
I know that within the council there is a staff employee of the month type of process, and often compliments are used as an example of why that member of staff might be congratulated or awarded, etc. So they are very useful. What we've found over the last couple of years, I think because of COVID and everyone working from home, etc., there has been a tendency for people to forget logging compliments. So we have recently reiterated the importance of keeping departmental logs of compliments, so because it's really good, rich data that we can demonstrate in the report. So we have seen higher volumes of compliments in the past, but we will improve that situation again, I think.
Yeah, great. I'd like to draw this particular section to a close now. It's been really helpful to get the debate and helpful to see some of the examples and the illustrations as well. You did ask a very specific question in item 6, which was for this committee to recommend any areas of future scrutiny. I don't know whether you've had any, I don't know whether we've got any in the room, or whether that's something that people, members of this committee want to take away. And then suggest, Councillor Allen.
It's just a question and a query, really. Do we have any obligation, in light of the adverse publicity with a housing association not really having a property fit for purpose, if we have an obligation as a council to make sure we're assessing our housing providers?
Yeah, we have no council housing stock, unlike other councils, but we do obviously have housing associations that are very prominent in the city, and customers can make complaints about the situation of their property, whether it be antisocial behaviour, repairs, that sort of thing, to their housing provider. But if they're not getting a response, they can use the council's housing enforcement team to make a referral, and they will investigate housing association complaints in the same way that they do private sector landlords. So they do have that obligation under the housing enforcement terms. We don't see as many public housing providers who customers feel that they need to come to us about, because they do generally have really good housing complaints processes for their customers. But occasionally it does happen, but that would not be a complaint that my team would report on, but we do still see customers coming to us saying, how do I get a complaint about my public landlord, put through the council's process, and we would signpost them to the housing enforcement team.
Thank you. Councillor Ali.
Yeah, just in response to your question about thoughts of anything else that we might want to incorporate. And just how Councillor Allen's just mentioned about housing providers, I dealt with a case where the actual service being provided by the housing provider was not a service they were providing on behalf of the city council, but in their private capacity, which got me thinking. There's going to be organisations that do public work as well as private work, and if they have a very high complaint rate on the private side and they keep the public happy, they retain contracts but at the same time offer a shoddy service, and potentially use the fact that they've got association with the city council to generate business that other competitors purely operating in a private space might not. So for that reason, I think it'd be very interesting to get complaints information about not just Aragon, but also some of the housing providers that we have, and not just on the work that they take from us, but also the private work that they do, just so that we can get an idea of the perception that their customers have of them before we assign further contracts to them.
Yeah. Councillor Sanford, you got a question?
Yeah, just briefly in terms of what we might want to explore further as a committee. I think I've just been counting, and we've had 4 people ask questions about complaints relating to external contractors, external partners, housing associations. So would it be an idea if we could at some future date maybe have a report on the external partners that we deal with, and how complaints that relate to those partners are actually handled?
Linda.
I think apart from Aragon, where hopefully we're going to have more information in the future to report, because the other contractors that we're using currently, Serco, Scanser, use the council's complaints process, we're providing all of the detail that those complaints, as you said, MPS, we haven't had any high volume MPS areas. I know there was a particular complaint that did take a protracted period of time, but we don't have a lot of complaints about NPS or property services in general. So that level of detail is kind of under the other departments area. So I've tried to highlight the main service areas that get complaints, from housing needs, council tax, adults and children's services, etc. And some of the other services have such a small number, electoral services, licensing, we hardly ever get many complaints from those areas. So I could certainly try and do it, but there probably wouldn't be much value in the information that I was providing. And going back to the issue about housing providers, we don't have any authority over those services, so we wouldn't be able to manage their complaints. But what you could do, that housing providers will have information about their complaints on their website, hopefully, and the Housing Ombudsman is a great source of information in terms of what providers are doing well and what the sort of areas they're concerned about.
Okay, Councillor Allen.
I think just as a comeback on that, could you not go to the officers that maybe service those areas and ask them for the level of complaints that they might get? Because as a councillor, how do you know? How do you know what to look for if you don't see it?
Housing enforcement, the complaints made to them are about other organisations. They're not complaints about the council. So my team manage complaints about the council rather than complaints that the council manage for people. So, for example, planning enforcement, housing enforcement, noise complaints, they've all got complaints in the title, but they're not complaints about council services. They're services that councils provide to try and help customers resolve problems. So it wouldn't be for my area, I suppose, is there?
Yeah, so I think to try and draw this debate to a close, I think this committee has a concern about complaints that might come through contractual third parties, whether they're directly about the council or whether they're about services provided which are perceived to be by the council or are being paid for by the council, even though they're provided by somebody else. So I think if we can try and apply that lens to the flow of complaints, and maybe we could ask the procurement team when they're looking at contracts to make sure that we're getting the complaint information through, and if it's not a contractual condition, that it should be, so that we can still see the total picture, both what's directly council and what is sort of privately contracted, if you like. And I think that will then start to inform us a bit more about because I think I kind of agree with Councillor Allen on you only know what you know, so you don't know what you don't know, and these things may be happening, but they're not coming through the flow of information. So I think it's right that it should, if it's indirectly provided by the council.
Probably just needs to come through a different service than mine, because we only deal with complaints against council services.
Yes, precisely. But we're here as an audit committee about the council in total, accepting kind of your department. Okay. Thank you. Quite a lively debate, a bit longer than I was expecting in terms of the topic, but it is a sensitive one, and it has quite a lot of risk on the reputational front as well as a financial one. So I'd rather have that conversation. So on the basis of that conversation, I think, Dan, you've got minutes for those actions. Can we move to the recommendations, note the changes to the complaints process, and note those recommended areas for future scrutiny? Okay. Great. Thank you. Move on from item 6 to item 7. The item 7 is the internal audit mid-year progress report, which I think Julie is going to introduce.
Good evening, everyone. The report in front of you this evening is the mid-year progress report that gives you an outline of the work that the internal audit team has been undertaking up to the end of September. It's based on the annual audit report that was approved by committee in March 22, and I think the bulk of the work that we've been undertaking tonight, you'll see the details are attached in Appendix A and B. If I can talk you through some main highlights that form part of that report. Resources is always something that we talk about quite a lot. The plan itself was based on an establishment of 6.1, which was reduced further as a result of the Chief Internal Auditor having non-audit activities, so that was reduced by 0.5. And at the time, we also had a member of the team that was on secondment in the hub. So the plan itself outlined that based on the staffing levels of 4.6, it showed the type of work that we were able to deliver. And if we were able to increase resources back to 5.6, then a lot of the work that was highlighted below the line would be undertaken. That said, the plan is very fluid. So even though there's work that's identified below the line, it doesn't necessarily mean that that will be undertaken. It's replaced by other work. We have a weighting mechanism of how we assess our work. So even items that are on the plan, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will be undertaken because other priorities come in. So the position of resources was that what we said we could achieve would be based on 4.6 full-time equivalent. Now, for one reason or another, the member of staff didn't return from the hub. there was protracted discussions within the business and also Cambridgeshire County Council, who were operating the hub as well, with regards to whether that member of staff would return, and it was a moving target, so unfortunately that didn't get resolved until September. In addition to that, we unfortunately lost a member of the team who passed away, and that was in September, and so that's further reduced our resources. I mean, the impact of losing Lee isn't just about the work that we'd got planned for him. He also had work in progress as well, and obviously it's had a big impact on the team itself. So we are where we were where we were in September. So we've been out to advert recently with the intention to recruit 2 permanent members of staff. The return hasn't been overly great. However, there does appear to be one application that we are looking to explore further. So we will be progressing that. As a result of that, I have looked to see what the long-term options are for us. So we have a process within the authority to gain authority to look for short-term resources. So that process is ongoing at the moment, and I've done that so that when Steve returns from leave, we can look at some additional options as well. So where we are with that, we'll know in the next sort of couple of weeks or so. Having said that, we've still got to get the right people out in the market. So it doesn't necessarily mean that is a fix. It just means that we can go out and actually have a look and see what's out there. So that's where we are with resources at the moment. So the plan that you have before you is based on 4.6. We were hoping to have 2 people in place by January or during January, so that we could break the back of what's left. So at the moment, I can't give assurance on what that position will be, but we are doing our best to look to see how we can plug those gaps. So moving on, we, as a result of the audit plan and the fact that we're very fluid, you'll see in the appendix, we've got some jobs that have come above the line as new items of work, so they're identified in the appendix as new items of work. Where we've had to drop items, we've also shown those. And what I will say is that, it is very fluid, because even though at the moment in September we had one job that dropped below the line, it's likely that that's actually going to come above, but obviously something has to go as a result of that. But it means that we are forever reviewing what we need to do in terms of where the priorities are. So you'll see that all in the appendix where we've had additional resources. Some of them have been grants. We have been very grant heavy this year to date. It typically is the grant season in the first six months, because that's when the sign-off is required. We're getting lots more coming through from government, and some of that is you deal in year, and if we need to sign those off, then that's what we do. If we don't do them, somebody else would have to do them. So that's where we are at the moment. That isn't untypical with a lot of local authorities, that they are very sort of heavy driven by grants in the first part of the year. But that's not saying that doesn't have an impact when you've got a small team, because you are heavy resource laden on there. Where we can place reliance on other areas of work, then we obviously look to do that. We've got a couple of pieces of work that our colleagues in Cambridgeshire, where we've got shared services, they're looking to undertake pieces of work that we can take assurance from. They're actually picking up on in Peterborough's information. Similarly, there's a piece of work going on in Fenland at the moment where a number of authorities have got a shared interest in the piece of work. So we'll be talking to our counterparts there to understand what's going on. In terms of the interaction with Cambridgeshire and any assurance that we can gain from them, Louise and I have regular meetings with our opposite numbers in Cambridgeshire. So equally, their audit plan is continually changing, so that it may well be that they've picked up on a piece of work that wasn't in their original plan, and we can say, oh, actually, we're quite interested in that, and equally, they will do the same to us. So we're trying to sort of gain assurance wherever we can elsewhere. In addition to that, within the authority as well, and I've noticed on the action plan, it is about developing the audit, the assurance framework, and we're continually looking to see what we can and can't include. In terms of audit development, we have, even though we are a small team, we have undertaken some climate change training this year. You know, we're aware of the tight targets that the organisation has in terms of achieving their action plans, and we've been talking with our colleagues elsewhere in the business to look to see how we can perhaps build in some assurance work into our regular audit work that we do. We may undertake, one piece of work that looks at that, but it typically it's about when we start to prep a piece of work. Has that got any implications that might feed into something like that? So we're agreeing a protocol where we can talk to our colleagues elsewhere to say, we're picking up this piece of work. Is there something that maybe we can include that will help us to give some assurance in that sort of area? So that's in its early stages, but it's about what we can build in and not necessarily get quick wins, but it's about making sure that when we're going into an area that we are trying to actually see where we can cover assurance for other things within the business. And I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Okay, thank you for that, and thanks for the report. It is a good report, and I think this committee sympathises with the team as well in terms of the circumstances and the way that the year's unfolded. We are where we are, and we can only manage the time that remains. So I think from a committee perspective, we need to be thinking about so what assurance were we hoping to get versus what we are likely to get, and are there any gaps, and how does that impact on the annual governance statement, if at all? And then I think secondly, how can we help? Because I think that's important too. But we'll take some questions. I think Councillor Sanford.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. It's a very comprehensive report, and thank you for that. I've got a question about page 123, one of the new ones, CPCA quarterly claims. Before I ask the question, can I just check that I've got the right item? Is that about the £3.5 million each year that we pay to the combined authority for them providing transport services in Peterborough?
No, it's where we're receiving grants from them to provide pieces of work. So they can ask for assurance in various different ways. If it's funding that's coming from Department of Transport that gets passported over to us via them, then we provide that assurance back to the CPCA. But they may sometimes ask for additional work to be undertaken, and this is a slightly different process that they've taken this year. So it's a new process where they're looking for certain things to be signed off.
Okay, because the specific question I was going to ask is, you're probably aware there's a lot of concern at the moment because Stagecoach have been withdrawing a number of journeys. So people have been turning up at the bus stop and finding that their bus service has been cancelled. Now, for journeys where Stagecoach are doing that on a commercial basis, that's almost entirely up to them, really. But there are a number of services that they provide on the contract to the combined authority, predominantly evening and Sunday services. And we pay them an amount of, say, £3.5 million each year, which includes payment that we make to the combined authority, which they then pass on to Stagecoach. So the question I've been asking in various forums, and I may even ask it at the full council next week again, is where Stagecoach withdraw journeys that have been put on under subsidy, does the combined authority get reimbursed for that, and does Peterborough City Council get reimbursed? Now, it may well depend on what the nature of the contract is, whether we pay them a lump sum regardless of whether the journeys operate, or whether we pay them on a per journey process. But is that something that you could look into perhaps?
So my knowledge of bus subsidies is that it used to be a grant that was provided to Peterborough City Council, and we undertook that role. And it wasn't, I think it was last year, those services moved over to the combined authority. So we didn't get any of that funding in Peterborough. They look after that themselves. So we don't actually have to sign off any grant work for bus subsidies now. That's all part of the CPCA. So in terms of grant, we don't get involved. But with regards to whether we can look at those sort of services, I don't know is the answer. But I can look to see how that works. Whether that would be as part of our assessment and our resources available, whether that would be top on the list for us to look at, then we'd have to look at it at that point. But we can certainly build it into our planning process if it does fall under Peterborough's area of responsibility, or what we can look at ready as part of the planning process moving forwards.
So, sorry, Councillor Coles, I think you had something to add to this as well.
If I may, Nick, just to interject, a very interesting question you bring up, and you're quite right to be curious about how our money is being spent. Is it aligned precisely to Peterborough, or is it being spent elsewhere? It's questions that are currently being asked in the combined authority. You might know I sit on the Overview and Scrutiny Committee there, and we are looking at that. But there is an alternate Audit Committee, which I think we have a member that sits on it, in front, who might very well be able to take that question ahead for you. Rather than expecting that we could do it with an internal audit here, I think the appropriate route might be for the Audit Committee in the combined authority.
I'll learn it, colleague, if you could take it.
Yeah, just make a note of the action, and I think the next meeting's on Friday. So if I can, I will.
If you need to have a conversation with me about precisely what I'm asking, I'm happy to do that outside the meeting. Yeah, okay, sure. The other question I'd got was, I think you did briefly allude to it, but I did notice there's on page, sorry, I need to put my glasses on to read the page numbers. On page 130 and 131, there's a couple of items relating to climate change which appear to have dropped out of the programme. So were you saying that you're pursuing those through a different course? Was that what you're saying? So, and because on the face of it, because climate change is an increasing problem and it's affecting us, so I'd be concerned if it was being dropped completely.
So we're looking at different ways that we can build things into the work that we're doing. So part of it is about every piece of work that we pick up. We will look to see if there's any consideration or anything we need to include, and ask team members about that at the time of planning that. And then there would be another piece, which you quite rightly have stated has dropped below the line, but that's coming above the line now. That's one of the pieces of work that's going to come above the line. So we are starting a piece of work on that to give us an overview of where we are.
Great. So I think, again, you've got criteria for which goes above the line and below the line, and it must meet all of those criteria. Great. Okay. Any more questions around the report? Any more concerns around the report in terms of, Mike?
I think there's a lot of explanation as to why this work's not been possible, but I think my fundamental conclusion on reading this report is that I don't think we are devoting enough resources to internal audit to deliver to this committee the assurance that it needs. I think we expressed our concerns at the planning stage, where I think we were very concerned at the number of high priority items that the internal audit team weren't going to be able to deliver because they had this member on secondment. We had a lot of debate about what was going to be done about that. I think the clear message was that that member was then going to come back from secondment, and that we were going to get a much higher coverage of the high priority audits in that audit plan. And I think the committee ought to put on record and deliver a strong message to the council that the resourcing of this team needs to be carefully reviewed, and I think the expectation from this committee should be that we get a larger volume of work and better coverage of the high priority audit risk areas that are identified in the plans than we received so far this year and are likely to receive for the remainder of the year.
Okay, and is that Cecilia that we would put that to? I know, Tricia, you're here in her stead, but if we can put that action directly to her and then see what the response is. Right. Okay, so hopefully that will help. Fine. If there are no more questions, then I'd like to move the recommendations on page 109, which is to note the mid-year progress report, which includes progress of the internal audit plan for 22-23. Do we agree with the recommendations as they are, plus the actions that we've just talked about? Okay. Yeah, I see nods. Thank you very much. Item 8. So after our teaching that we've had prior to this meeting on Treasury Management, we now have the Treasury Management mid-year update. So Tricia, you're going to lead us through that.
Yes, I had a nice introduction. I had a nice introduction planned, but you've had a better introduction with your 2-hour training, so I'll not add anything to the report and just open for questions. I do hope you enjoyed the training and found it useful. And I would welcome some feedback and we can take that back to Link.
Okay. So, any questions on the report? Personally, I found the report quite useful, and in particular the structure of it, where have we met the criteria that's within the strategy? Kind of yes or no, where are we at with the levels? And for members of this committee to be able to run their eye down each of those and say, yes, we're within bounds or we're within limits, etc. So I think that style of doing things, I think, is very helpful, because this is a specialist area, and it would be helpful to be led by what are the criteria that we should be meeting, or what are the limits that we're working up to, and are we under or over them? But anyway, any questions? Mike?
Yeah, I think just one from me. So one of the items that was included in some of the information that was circulated to the committee ahead of the meeting was an analysis of current borrowings and the current duration of borrowings, which indicated that we've got an average duration of about 25 years on our borrowings. Now, my recollection from some of the earlier papers on our financial position was that we've got an asset portfolio and therefore a capital financing requirement that's got a duration much more like 70 years. And I was just a little bit surprised at the magnitude of the gap that we've got there, and I was wondering if you could articulate for us what you saw as the exposures from a refinancing perspective that arise from quite such a large gap between the average duration of our liabilities and the average duration of our assets.
Right. I can't comment on the historical terms of whether they set loans for 50 years, 75 or 25 years. But certainly we are going through all the debt at the moment and doing an exercise to see whether it is possible to refinance any of that, and looking at what the premiums and the discounts are for refinancing. So that there are 1 or 2 areas where we can possibly refinance if they were at a lot higher rate than what the rates are now. We've got 40,000 which we've got to refinance between now and the end of this financial year. And what we're considering at the moment is whether that is to be done through internal borrowing or whether we go out to the market. And I think you've had the explanations about how high it is at the moment, but could be cheaper next year. So we're looking to see whether we just take some short-term borrowing, do the internal, but that would have an impact on our investment income, which we've just now started to build up. We've got more more organisations that we now invest in. So our debt, I think, as you say, is over 25 years, but we need to flatten out some of that and perhaps make it longer. I don't know whether it's fully answered your question.
I think absolutely it hasn't, and what it does is highlights for me my area of concern here, and that is that we are clearly not, and the explanation I've had is that you know, the recommendation from a policy perspective is that we shouldn't necessarily match our assets and liabilities. No. But I believe that we've got a position that we've inherited where we have a larger mismatch between our assets and liabilities than I think we ought to be comfortable with, and we should be thinking more carefully as we go forwards about, you know, what is that mismatch and what are the exposures arising from it, because clearly when you have that level of mismatch, then you end up having to refinance a larger proportion of your debt when it matures, simply because, you know, it's implicit that you will refinance pretty much all of your debt for 2 or 3 times. And if you're doing that in a scenario where you've got rising interest rates, then it becomes very costly. You know, you call into question some of the historic decisions that were made in terms of, you know, the assumptions around interest rates. And I think there's just a need in this whole strategy for a hard look at what are the duration mismatches and where would we like to be on those mismatches, because I think we've got too much of a mismatch. And we are in a position where we are absolutely going to have to refinance all of our debt probably 2 or 3 times, with the consequent exposure of, and you may have to refinance it at higher rates. So I think I'd like us to look at very carefully in our strategy, you know, what degree of mismatch are we comfortable with, either in terms of total duration or in terms of the proportion of our debt that would need to be refinanced on an ongoing basis, and have some kind of measure for looking at what our exposure and what our risk is as a result of, you know, those refinancing risks.
So just bring that into simple English. We can quantify the risk that you're explaining, which is that mismatch of the financing versus the life of the asset. So I think the request is to try and put some kind of quantification on it in terms of what that range of risk might be, given certain scenarios that might be, for example, on rising interest rates. And then the council has in its sights, is it a big risk or not? And as an audit committee, we can be comfortable that that risk is we're conscious of it and it's being covered.
We have another issue which distorts the figures as well, and that is when a school converts to an academy and we have to take the value of the asset out, but we still have the
effectively have the historic debt. You lose the assets, but you keep the debt. Yes, absolutely. But again, you still have a problem in terms of and refinancing that debt or repaying that debt.
Okay. So a question from Councillor Ali and then on to Councillor Sanford.
I think just a comment based around your question, Mike. Are you suggesting that the council should match both the asset portfolio and the liability portfolio, and if they're mismatched, know what the extent of the mismatch is?
I don't think it's a view that we should match. I think it's that we should understand what the risks associated with the mismatch are.
Yeah, because Nasbeen, one of the answers she gave earlier was around how new borrowing doesn't necessarily attach itself to a specific project. So you might have capital projects that have a particular duration, and in order to meet the expected cost of servicing your debt and repaying the nominal, you'd be building up a minimum revenue provision. So as long as the build-up of the minimum revenue provision is in line with the expectation of repayment of debt without potential future rolling, there's no risk. I fail to see where the remaining risk is if you've got an MRP that's being used to almost identically match the repayment. And I think there might be a mismatch risk there. The MRP might not quite have the same profile as the debt. But I wouldn't link, like I would link assets to liabilities if assets were what you were holding to ultimately pay your liabilities, but I don't think that's how the council operate.
Well, I think the way I look at it is that we've got assets that are going to be there for 70 years or so, and at the moment we're financing those with liabilities that have a duration of 25 years. What we're going to have to do in 25 years' time is refinance it all, and we're going to have to refinance. We're going to have to do that twice between now and the point at which those assets are matured, that we've charged all of the costs to revenue to repay all that debt, and therefore, in the event that interest rates are higher in the future, then it will cost us more to refinance it. And I think what I'm saying is I would like us to understand what the magnitude of the gap is and what the consequences of that risk are, so that we can take some informed decisions on how big do we allow it to become. So if you take an example of a bank would rigidly try and match its assets and liabilities, because if they don't, they go bankrupt. Northern Rock was a classic example of that. Councils don't go bankrupt, but what it does mean is that we will have a higher proportion of interest costs to bear in the future. And it's how much we can, how much are we prepared to tolerate, next time we refinance and the time we refinance after, that refinancing happening at a higher rate. And just understanding, therefore, the magnitude of the gap and what it could cost us over the duration of the asset.
Yeah, so it's a quantification of a risk based on certain scenarios. And I think what Mike's articulating is, let's just do those sums and see whether, and then we can consciously make a decision on, are we happy with that level of risk or not, or do we need to change the strategy somehow? But it will be an interesting exercise. Just to understand it. Councillor Sanford, you had a question.
Yeah, I just to make a comment on the training. I think it was really interesting, but I think we could have maybe done with slightly longer, because I think at the end it did get a bit curtailed. I'm slightly nervous about asking a question about this, because others obviously understand these matters much more than I do. But one of my problems is sometimes I can remember things from quite some time ago, and I've sat here in this council chamber listening to lots of sets of budget proposals over the years, and I'm sure I can remember from about 2 or 3 years ago that when we were in a period of really low interest rates, that we were told that what was going to happen was the council was adopting a policy of rescheduling its loans where it could do over a longer period to lock in the lower interest rates. But I'm now sort of hearing that hasn't happened. So why then? I don't know.
Because we haven't had our eye on it, we haven't been looking at the mismatch. And I think if you go back to the training was very clear. The expectation would be that when you're in a period of low interest rates, that would be when you're looking to extend the duration of your loans, to lock in for as long as possible those lower interest rates, and having a weather eye on the magnitude of the refinancing risk would have encouraged us potentially to do more refinancing while rates were lower at longer terms than we may have done.
Absolutely, I can see the logic of that, but I think the question I'm asking is, given the fact we were told that was the policy, so it appears it hasn't happened then, so...
I think it could have been looked at. In a lot of councils we did that, and certainly in the authority I was working at the time, probably about 4 years ago, we did look at that, but there was an issue. It was going to cost a lot more in revenue to refinance because of the additional costs of the premium.
In the short term.
Yeah.
But again, the answer is and because we've not done it and not borne that cost in the short term, in the longer term, we're now going to bear higher rates when we refinance.
So I think in conclusion, we are where we are. Perhaps something should have happened before, and what Mike's highlighting is that if we can start to quantify it and build some scenarios, we can make that conscious decision. And it may be that a refinancing cost to get to lower interest rates, the premiums are so much that it just doesn't pay back and it's not worthwhile. But we need to be making conscious decisions on it rather than unconscious decisions.
Certainly a piece of work we can do.
If we stay with the same example in the banking world, the reason certain banks went bankrupt was because they chose to stay at the short duration because that was where they could get the cheapest money, but where they should have been was at a longer duration and paying a little bit more in the short term to maintain the long-term survivability of the council. And that analogy does apply here. We need to be monitoring the magnitude of this risk and very clearly looking at, at what point do we extend the duration of our financing in the interest rate cycle.
I just think the only point I'd make is that, given the fact this was supposed to be happening a few years ago, if we now try and do it, we're going to be doing it at much higher interest rates. That's the only point.
I'm not necessarily advocating doing it now. What I'm advocating is getting the measures and the quantification in place to enable us to monitor this, to decide when we should do it and when is the right time to extend the duration again. And I would certainly not expecting us to be extending duration in a higher interest rate environment. We should have been doing it in a lower interest rate environment.
Yeah. Okay, so we are where we are, and if we can put another indicator on the dashboard of our financial management, then that would be helpful. Okay, conscious of time, we've had our training, we've been through this paper. I just had a little concern when I was reading about the recommendations for this committee, where the paper actually says in point 2 to recommend to full council approval to add additional non-specified investments detailed in Appendix C. I don't think it's for this committee to recommend to full council anything to do with adding investments. I think what we can do is say that we have no objection to the recommendations that are in here, but we're not promoting them or recommending them. So there's just a slight wording change there, Dan, that we need to put into the recommendation on here. So on that basis, if there aren't any more questions, then the recommendations that we're asked to look at is to review the Treasury Management Strategy Statement, mid-year position and performance against the prudential indicators, which we've done, and to review the non-specified investments that have been recommended within Appendix C. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we'll just put that we've recommended to consider.
To consider it, but we're not recommending it. Yeah.
Yes, Chair, so it's recommendation for consideration.
Thank you. Okay. So are we comfortable with that? Yeah, I'm seeing some nods. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Moving on to a very important item 9, the Audit Committee start time. Dan, do you want to just give us the history, and maybe we can do this in 5 minutes?
Yes, the history, okay. So this year we started at 6 p.m. The past 2 years have been a 5 p.m. start. And previous to that was, the general start was the 7 p.m. slot. Obviously the Audit Committee can choose this time slot that suits them best. It then gets recommended on to full council with a calendar of meetings, so that's where we are.
Okay, my thought process, we're currently meeting at 6. Does anybody have any objections to continuing to meet at 6 for the foreseeable future? No objections whatsoever? Then let's continue to meet at 6. Thank you very much. That's item 9. Item 10, debt write-offs. There's no updates on this area, so item 10 is extremely quick. Item 11, page 157 of the pack. Decisions made by the Shareholder Cabinet Committee. So this item is just to note the decisions of the Shareholder Cabinet Committee. Do members have any questions or comments on that paper? I'm seeing no comments or questions. So I shall take it that we are content with that. That's item 11. Item 12, the work programme 2022-23. So this is on page 161 of the PDF pack. So the work programme lays out the thoughts so far for the next 12-18 months. But Dan, do you want to say whether you've added or changed anything?
Not too much to change, no. But it's just obviously for members to look through. Obviously, if there are items that they would like to include on the work programme, then you can let me know, you can let the committee know, let yourself know, Chair, and we can add those on.
Okay, Councillor Ali?
So I think we discussed at the last meeting, and also I think it was one of the actions. I've not looked at this. You're going to tell me it's in there, aren't you? The procurement. So update on procurement progress.
Yes. So what we've got in January is I'm got to speak to Richard and Mark, who came to the committee last time, so that if there are any areas where there were concerns, teams, for example, who may not follow the procurement process, to come to the committee and explain why they hadn't done that.
Okay, so this one is slightly different. At FSWG, we talked about procurement being one of the key budget items, and for us to track that in the audit committee.
I think there is something down for March as well, potentially, as an update to what they produce.
Could you maybe just send to me what you think, what that might look like, and if I think there's a gap, we can circle back. Thank you.
Yeah, so from my perspective, I think procurement need to come back, and I think there's a number of issues that they need to come back on. So it would be good to get a comprehensive list, and then we can ask for that information to come through. Yeah. Okay. There are no more recommendations. Then this particular agenda item is always open. So if anything happens in between meetings that you think we ought to be looking at, or certain things have arisen, then do mention them outside of the meetings. Item 13. Members are being asked to agree going into exempt session for item 14 due to the sensitivity of the item and information. Can we agree at this point to exclude the press and the public from the meeting?
It's fairly academic because there aren't any here, but could you just explain a bit more reason why we need to go into exempt session?
This is due to the reports that we're about to discuss, and the report was from the Financial Reporting Council to us about Ernst & Young, and the parties concerned, it's a confidential report, commercially sensitive between those parties, so it makes sense to do it in that exempt manner. Okay.
Yeah, it was part of the exempt pack.
Yeah, we can get to the detail of it when we go into the exempt session.
I thought I saw on the agenda it was going to be like a verbal report. I don't think.
No, so on the when I circulated the link, which has the public reports, there's an attachment to it that has the exempt pack, which this will be at the very bottom of.
Yeah. It's there. Okay, so we'll go into our exempt session in just a couple of minutes. We'd just like to bear with us.